Mr. Candidate, you confront a committee which was appointed by the Council of Deans and it is charged with the task of examining both your dissertation and the propositions submitted therewith. Professor Gill from the University College in London, who joins us online, you are all online. The three of us are the only ones who are live here to make it official, but you're all online, and of course, thank you for collaborating. Professor Gill, please go ahead.
Dear Mr. Candidate, can you tell me what the biggest theoretical contribution your thesis makes to the existing literature?
Hogelede opponents. So the biggest theoretical contribution is an interesting question, I think. For my money, part of the underlying logic of the thesis was really to question conceptually this idea of online radicalization. And I think the front end, the empirical side of that, does that in an interesting way by looking at terrorist behaviors. But then as we try to then contextualize those findings, I think the biggest theoretical contribution of the thesis is that it questions what is actually the sense of dichotomizing anything in day-to-day life into online and offline. So I think, if anything, one of the biggest advancements of technology over the last 2 decades is that technology has come to a point where it has really intermingled both domains into a point in which they are quite inseparable, I think. And I think we can see this demonstrated throughout the thesis. So whether it's individuals streaming radical propaganda online, but doing so in a room with their friends and then discussing it afterwards and recommending more content online, I think this really blurs this distinction of online and offline. So what I suggest, and I draw from a group of internet philosophers who coined the term on life, rather than online or offline. And they suggest that the current state of the world, the kind of our ontological state of being, is in a way, it amalgamates the two in a point that, as I mentioned, is inseparable. So what I think my contribution of this thesis is I bring that ontological perspective to the world of terrorism, to security studies or criminology, or whichever field the kind of terrorism studies happens to sit in. I think it really questions this kind of concept of online radicalization and argues that it is not, it's already demonstrated that it's not empirically useful, but I also think it is not theoretically useful.
Moving beyond your theoretical contributions, what is the main contribution to knowledge that your thesis has made?
So again, as Professor Gill has argued in his research, there are still so few data-driven studies that look at terrorist use of the internet. We are, in the last 5 years or so, more and more have kind of sprung up, and there's been some really interesting research, empirical research done. But adding to this kind of dearth of data-driven research is, I think, one of kind of the key empirical findings. And really, again, going back to the last point, it really challenges this idea of online radicalization. It empirically demonstrates that the internet is not replacing the offline domain, that in fact these online and offline behaviors are very strongly intertwined. And the fact that there is such a low empirical basis for this knowledge, I think, really helps situate this research with kind of a large-ish sample size for terrorism studies, and demonstrates kind of yet again that this is kind of a flawed concept empirically.
And what was the result that surprised you the most empirically?
I think without a doubt that is the idea that for individuals who use the internet, this is either to engage in an online network or to learn and plan about their plot online, that they were less likely to be successful than the individuals that did not do so. That was certainly not one that I was expecting at all. And I think it really raises a lot of very interesting questions about the way in which we are moderating content online and whether we are potentially damaging law enforcement's ability to conduct terror investigations.
And in your thesis, you collect and code a lot of original data. What was the biggest challenge you faced in doing so?
Yeah, a really good question. So it's a lot of challenges in collating a database of this size. I would personally say, and I think this probably goes to the heart of social science research methods in general, but particularly ones that rely on secondary sources, is how we code for missing data. So I think there are two schools of thought on this within terrorism studies. So you can either, so let's say, for example, I am trying to ascertain whether an individual used an end-to-end encrypted app. So there's two ways in which I can do that. I can either look for evidence in which it exists, and if so, code it as it being present, or I can, if I don't find that evidence, I can code it as not. And that's the approach I took. Basically, did the individual use, WhatsApp, Telegram, whatever? If I found evidence, yes. If I didn't find evidence, no. Now, some people would argue that this relies on an assumption that missing data is more likely to be negative than it is positive, which I think is absolutely true. This is an assumption which comes with this style of coding, and all else being equal in terms of social science research methods, we want to try and minimize the assumptions we're making. So a number of other scholars would take a different approach where they would, if there was strong evidence that they did do it, they would code it as yes. If there was confirmatory evidence that they didn't do it, they would confirm it as no. Or if they didn't find anything, they would code it as don't know. And then when you run these statistical tests, you can make a dummy variable to either include the knows and don't knows or just remove the don't knows whatsoever. And this kind of method relies on fewer assumptions about what's going on within things we don't know about. Now, I make the point that for the data at hand, I took the right approach. And I'll refer back to your work, Professor Gill, where you had on a similar database of terrorists had made the point that these finding a definitive no is extremely unlikely when relying on open source reporting. It is, for the most part, not in the interests of the people writing these kinds of reports to say that something did not happen. And I think that absolutely holds for this sample as well. So I think for the most part, it's about finding the right coding approach. But I think this is an important limitation of what we're doing. And it's kind of a challenge about how we infer answers from the data from it.
So when you talk about the coding challenges in chapter 4 of your thesis, it's clear you rely on a range of sources to inform the data coding itself. To what degree are you over-reliant on the indictments and the FBI documents? And to what degree did the other sources triangulate and confirm what was in those sources?
This is a really important question. It is absolutely the case that the richest data are certainly from the court documents. I would probably say it's more mixed in terms of the court documents, because some of them happen at the arrest and charging stage, so the indictment and the criminal complaint and things like that. But a good number of them happen at the sentencing phase as well, where both the government and the defence will write extremely in-depth memorandums as well. And I typically found these to be the deepest and richest kinds of data as well. However, I did find that the triangulation between journalistic sources and court documents complemented each other very well. So the court documents tended to be very roundabout. Person X did this at this time on this date, and it really gives you a step-by-step, often in the immediate days or weeks leading up to the execution of someone's plot. Whereas the flip side of that is the journalistic sources, as you would expect from a journalistic source, would take a much more human-centered approach. They would instead perhaps do interviews with people that went to school with them, even sometimes with family, even sometimes with the individuals themselves, although obviously there are limitations about taking individuals' words at face value, so it requires rigor and critical thinking as approach to coding. So I think there is no doubt that the bulk of the database was made up from these kind of court documents, and they contain very rich data. But the journalistic sources were very important, and I feel quite complementary in the triangulation as well.
So thinking further afield from your thesis, I mean, as the title of your thesis suggests, it's on a group in a specific geographical context in a specific temporal period of time. How generalizable do you think the findings are? And you can choose either beyond this group or beyond that geography or beyond this sort of time period.
It's a good question. So the generalizability is always going to be an interesting question in terms of how much we can take when assessing the next threat. And I'm minded to think about how the commentary around terrorism has changed so much, even since completing this thesis. And now it's all far-right terrorists and January 6th and things like that. The short answer is there will always be a kind of a spatial temporal element to it, and we can't assume that anything will definitely translate over. That being said, at the very least, it makes a very interesting basis of comparison when moving on to future projects to, again, use similar coding systems and question whether, again, for example, far-right US terrorists display the same kinds of behaviors, particularly if you do replication, of variables and replication of approaches. That being
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Gill, for your contribution. Before we move on, you all notice, of course, that we experience some problems with the sound. We can only do better if we take a break. But if you are all capable of understanding what the candidate says... Sorry? Okay. Okay, the problem is not online, it's only here in the room. So that means that we can go on, we can still understand it, yes. Okay, then, Professor Gill, thank you very much for your contribution. We move on to Europol in The Hague, to Dr. Wyman. Dr. Wyman, please go ahead.
Thank you, Chair. Dear candidate, you argue in your thesis that there's no causal link between online propaganda and the propaganda campaign of the Islamic State and these incidents that you analyze. Now, if you look at the temporal distribution of the incidents, you see that they coincide, so the peaks of the incidents coincide well with certain phases of the propaganda, notably the declaration of the caliphate and then the intense calls by IS to perpetrate lone act attacks in the West. So what is then the importance of such a propaganda campaign, and to what extent does it actually influence, or does it not influence violent behavior?
Sehr geehrte opponents. So the relationship of propaganda and the potential causal effect is a really fascinating part of terrorism studies right now. And I think I would probably just suggest that I don't necessarily argue that there's no, or I'm not arguing against the cause.
Is our expert in the room?
Yeah, there's an expert. He's working on it.
Okay. Ik kan de toon, zeg maar, begrijpen, maar de inhoud toch wat minder. Maar as long as the members of the committee
Apparently,
debate, that's also important. But they can translate afterwards. pandemisch geschikt atmosphere. Last year it was in the room upstairs, and it's more like a studio, and it's okay, you know, it's a studio setting, but this is this place with people. Yeah, it really looks like, oh my god.
Zij gaan gewoon verder.
Ja, nou,
Dat is wel handig. Klopt dat, Lionel? Gaan zij gewoon verder? Oké.
Dus ik ben even proberen het systeem opnieuw op te starten.
Ja, is goed.
Iets sinds een maand.
Het is wel lekker rustig.
als een beelden kun je wel zien als het goed is.
Yeah, you can see that.
This is a much design.
He's answering confidently. You can see that. Komt ie aan.
For all of the propaganda the court documents or or any of the data mentioned that people had watched, what I found was that by far and away the most popular propagandist was Anwar al-Awlaki, who not only had no affiliation whatsoever to the Islamic State, but he died a couple of years before the declaration of the Caliphate, at a point, in fact, in which Al-Qaeda was pretty hostile with that group. This is, I think, a really interesting question, which gets to your point of, does the group's official propaganda matter that much if someone who was not related to the group is by far and away the most popular propagandist? And I think what I would argue is having a charismatic English-speaking preacher is far more important for getting people motivated, getting people involved, and going back to your previous question, starting and engaging that dialectical process than necessarily the oftentimes very theologically heavy, very scripture-based propaganda of the Islamic State. So I think the answer to your question is no, not necessarily, and we can demonstrate that by the popularity of Al-Awlaki, the popularity of Inspire magazine, and things like that, which have really nothing to do with the Islamic State.
So given that, I mean, what would be the implications for policies trying to prevent radicalization online, if that exists? Because the easiest approach usually is to focus on a certain organization and group and just try to evict that group from a certain social media or a platform or others. Do you think that is a viable way to at least limit the impact?
Yes, it is certainly a viable way to limit the impact. So we can certainly look at For example, let's take for example the Global Internet Forum to Counter Terrorism, which have developed quite sophisticated hash sharing methods and things like that to block out propaganda that they are very sure belongs to a certain group, and using it in a way that depends on group affiliation is probably one of the easiest ways to do that. But it will not necessarily tell the whole story in terms of how you block this kind of content or how you stop these kind of dialectical processes. So I think another one of the interesting findings from looking at how people are engaging on social media is that, again, the cohort themselves are creating and sharing a huge amount of low-level content that they've created themselves. So I think Professor Maura Conway calls this kind of prosumers. So it's people that are both producing and consuming at the same time. And this is jokey memes, this is GIFs, this is all manner of things like this. This is pictures of themselves with AK-47s and things like that. Now, it seems to me that by solely focusing on hashing a certain group to block that kind of content, yeah, that might be effective at stopping that kind of content, but does not necessarily stop that kind of low-level content. In terms of your question of how's best to solve it, I don't think there's necessarily a really clear way of doing it. And I think this perhaps goes back to the wider question that maybe it isn't an online-only approach in terms of dealing with this. To go back to the main findings of the thesis is that it is not just online, and whether we're calling it CVE or some kind of intervention, that we shouldn't be thinking only about running interventions in the online domain.
Yeah, linked to that actually would be my last question. That is, would you think that if we hadn't had this huge campaign from IS injecting propaganda content into these radical communities, do you think the dynamics would have been different? I mean, if for example, you compare it to a more horizontal movement like QAnon, I would argue. Is it more coherent maybe? So does maybe the IS propaganda provide coherence to the larger movement rather than QAnon, which metastasis all around?
So I believe that the propaganda, and the propaganda that the Islamic State put out there, you could certainly make the argument that it had a degree potentially of effectiveness because of the dynamics of the group and what was happening in the world related to that group at the time. So I'm minded to think of kind of a relatively well-known concept within strategic communications, which is called the say-do gap, which ultimately says your propaganda, whether it's to try and persuade people towards terrorism or to try and dissuade them from them, your propaganda has got to match up to what's happening in the real world. So when the Islamic State says, yeah, first of all, come and join us, we're building a state, it's going to be utopia, that is only credible to anyone insofar as they are winning battles on the battlefield and they are engaging in this kind of a proto-state or whatever official title we want to give it. So I think the dynamics of the propaganda are particularly important only insofar as they actually, what is going on in the real world help the argument progress.
Thank you. Thank you, Dr. Wyman, for your contribution. The examination shall now be continued by Professor Duivenstein. Welcome. Please go ahead.
Thank you very much. I hope you can all hear me. I hope the sound problems in the room have been resolved. I'd like to start by congratulating the candidate with a wonderful, very readable thesis. It was a pleasure to access the rich data that you provided us with. But we're here for critical examination, and it might not surprise you that I want to talk a little bit more at your methodology, in particular, the methodology related to grounded theory. I think there is a problem with the approach you have adopted related to grounded theory. What I would like in your answer to this question is to reflect a little bit more on the shortcomings and limitations of grounded theory, because that is what I think is missing in the written text. And I'm sure that you have broader ideas about the value of grounded theory. Based on the written round in the examination, you have now in the final manuscript changed your approach to grounded theory by using the term grounded theory inspired. It's not a solution to what I see as a major issue related to what you have done and what you've tried to do with the thesis. So again, compliments for compiling a wonderful data set, 201 cases, very rich detail. We can really get a grasp of the dynamics of these cases. And I think it ties into wider scientific developments of using rich data, artificial intelligence. Just this week, I was reading an article about the use of AI in the future, which will provide us with a potential of post-theory science, that we have such a wealth of information that we can identify trends and patterns simply based on the data, and then what does theory mean? My question in particular, can you give us a sense of what the discussion was about the adoption of this method? What other methods have you considered? And what do you see as the major impediments of using this grounded theory inspired method? Because using database analysis is only worth so much. And we've already talked about the coding criteria, the coding, the algorithms, the methods that we apply to the data. The second part of my question relates to the findings that the grounded theory method or the grounded theory inspired method has offered. In your analysis, you point out that there are three major points of focus that this grounded theory inspired method brings forward. It's about content, so the content of the data. It has to do with the gendered angle, the women, and their particular dynamics, and the individuals, which make me think women are not individuals. Why did you separate those? But what is significantly missing in this grounded theory application is the context, the environment, and you stress that environment so strongly in your conclusion. So the environment and what happens beyond the online-offline discussion is hugely important. So there I see a major challenge for this methodology that you have applied, and I would like to hear more of your reflections on this.
Jorge opponents. So this is a really interesting question. So do you mind if I just try and dissect precisely what the question? So first of all, asking for reflection on why I initially decided to think about grounded theory, what the limitations are in the context of this research, and then think about perhaps other methods that would have been useful. And then I gather from the end kind of a reflection on particularly that section which reflects on the female terrorists.
Yes, or what you have learned from the applicability of grounded theory based on what you found by using the method. So when you look back on the process, you came up with a certain set of factors which only give you a very small part of the picture, because you substantially widen the picture in your analysis and conclusion. So what has the method brought you?
Great. So my underlying logic behind adopting grounded theory was the starting point was that I collected data for the database, and exactly as you say, it was incredibly rich, far richer than I had kind of expected from the start. And the initial plan had always been to conduct a kind of a quantitative database analysis. But then coding this line by line, it became apparent that there were incredibly rich qualitative data that could be derived to understand kind of radicalization, what particular factors that fundamentally didn't conform to ones and zeros. So from that point, I decided that some kind of a qualitative methodology was going to be appropriate, and it would complement the quantitative aspect to it. So then moving from that point, I thought that given that the quantitative analysis in chapter 5 is fundamentally, at least primarily, deductive in nature. So I replicated many of the variables that Professor Gill had used in his previous research, as well as adding others that I derived from the academic literature. Now, My thought then is that because we've got something which is primarily deductive and quantitative in nature, there would be considerable benefit to constructing something that was inductive and qualitative in nature. So running some kind of inductive qualitative analysis seemed incredibly appropriate. So my thought was that grounded theory is the prime candidate within qualitative methodologies for trying to understand this. Now, you're absolutely right. There are kind of fundamental issues of grounded theory that are somewhat at odds with, really, to be honest, with running a mixed methods approach like this. So the purist grounded theory scholars will say to be truly inductive in the way that they see grounded theory, they recommend against individuals using, conducting literature reviews beforehand, and importantly as well, the data set must be kind of uncapped. So the general way of approaching grounded theory problems is that that you start looking at data, and then if that takes you in a certain direction, then that's important to then look. So perhaps a good example of this might be if you were interviewing someone who mentioned a piece of legislation, it might be an important part to then reflexively think about the legislation. Now, this is clearly not an approach that I've taken. I think it is not possible to run this kind of a methodology whilst being a doctoral candidate in the 21st century, given what needs to happen to even apply for a PhD. Most people need to write a kind of a literature review to even do that. But then most importantly, once you start a PhD, almost always the first thing you do is that you write a literature review and acquaint yourself with the topic. So this is my kind of underlying logic for saying this is clearly not absolutely a kind of absolute grounded theory, but instead an inspired approach. And I think it is still worthwhile to call it grounded theory because the coding component, so the 3 stages of coding from descriptive to substantive to theoretical, very much mirror the tradition of grounded theory methodology, as well as things like keeping memos, as well as things like concepts like constant comparison and things like that. So this is how I landed on the idea of calling it grounded theory inspired, because to be quote unquote pure grounded theory, it would not be appropriate to call it that, given the deductive chapter and the literature review chapter and things like this.
Thank you. Thank you, Professor Duivenstein, for your contribution. The discussion shall be continued by Professor Koops. Welcome here, and please go ahead.
Thank you. Meneer de kandidaat. I enjoyed reading and commenting on the draft substantive dissertation immensely. So thanks for that. I walk one step back. I mean, there's been some strong discussions now on methods, theoretical contributions. My question is aiming a little bit for the conceptualization of key terms. And one of them, of course, is radicalization, and the other one is online radicalization. You write in your own thesis on page 22, you try to provide a variety of definitions, but also note in various steps that in the debate, the definition of radicalization and conceptualization is highly contested and difficult. And you add even one more level of difficult and diffusion by putting the online in front of it, so online radicalization. So my question is just simply now reflecting on the completed thesis, and how far is this ambiguity of the term of radicalization and online radicalization making the entire research and research question and conceptualization of this term difficult?
So this is a really interesting question. What is the endpoint? Exactly as you said, we start off with this double conceptual confusion, and then realizing where we get to at the end. And I think what I would say to that is we have this the concept of, I think the underlying logic of the thesis is kind of first and foremost an exploration into the term online radicalization, which is why those first 2 chapters are framed before the empirical way of looking at it comes out. Now, I don't think necessarily that that it's well, for the radicalization aspect, I don't think that that necessarily is resolved by the work in this thesis. I think the conclusion that I come to at the end of that chapter is, look, here are a lot of really problematic ways in which it is not only conceptually confused in itself, but the STEM words are all conceptually confused. The deployment is confused and incredibly value laden too. And then basically what I say to that is, nothing is perfect. Here is the approach that I'm going to use, and I choose a kind of a working definition focused very much on terrorist behaviors instead. That doesn't mean that I think that that is the kind of the final say in all topics of radicalization. Some people will be much more focused on beliefs, and this is fine. And I think that the research should, as long as the research is specific and definitionally clear about what it's doing, that's fine. But that's kind of a debate that I kind of, by adopting a working definition, I say this debate is here. This is what I'm doing. But what I would say in terms of the online part is, and this perhaps takes me back slightly to my first answer, that what I think is most appropriate is simply just to challenge even the concept. Even let's take terrorism out of it for a second. I'm not sure that the concept of online even holds up now. So this I think really makes a challenge of the idea of specifically using phrases like online radicalization. And I think really the discussion chapter towards the back end really tries to highlight that, again, bringing terrorism back in, when you look at individual cases, and the case study that I use to help to try and understand the information environment, what we can say is that one person may look at this and, using their own criteria, say this is a case of online radicalization. Another person might look at it and say this is a case of offline radicalization. But in reality, a lot of the behaviors that this individual engaged in were not particularly, cannot easily be demarcated into being either online or offline. So my suggestion in kind of challenging this concept is to say that we should, well, far be it from me to tell other people how they should frame problems and frame words or whatever, but it is not a concept, I think, that holds up to either empirical, theoretical, or ontological scrutiny.
Thank you.
Thank you for your contribution. The examination shall be continued by Professor Schuurman uit Leiden. Welkom. Ga uw gang.
Ja, dank u wel. Wish I was professor yet, but it's still doctor, I'm afraid. Doesn't matter though. Geachte kandidaat. One of the questions I would like to ask you has to do a little bit more with reflecting on the applicability of your main findings to some current debates. So one of your main conclusions is to be wary of notions of the internet as a game changer for radicalization, right? So you warn us that these kinds of statements are, a little bit besides the truth, let me put it that way. I would say, though, that your research has dealt mostly with Islamic State at a time in its development when it could be said to be at its heyday. And you've looked at North American cases in particular, which at this point is already, some 5 years ago. And a lot of time has passed, particularly when we're looking at the development in terms of technology. So recently, during this COVID pandemic that we're all still in the middle of, we've seen a lot of different forms of radicalization emerge related to anti-vaccination sentiments, anti-government sentiments as well, clear conspiracy theories such as QAnon, which I think someone has already referred to. And one of the distinguishing characteristics of these forms of radicalization is that they seem to be, if not entirely, then at least strongly kind of rooted in the online domain. So when you argue that we should not overstate the role of radicalization for a group of IS, I'm wondering what would happen if you were to, let's say, disaggregate your result a little bit. So rather than looking, so if you made a distinction between forms of radicalization based on ideological affiliation. So your results hold up for IS, but would they also hold up for the more recent extremist varieties we've seen? So in other words, do recent developments related to online extremism and radicalization not offer a counterpoint to your conclusion about the the limited role of the internet as a standalone venue for radicalization. If you could reflect on that, please. Thank you.
Sehr geehrte opponents. This is a really interesting question, and this is something that I would personally like to develop further in future research. So one of the first reflection that came to me when you were asking your question was that sometimes I feel, whether we're talking about, again, the far right and in January 6th, or whether we're talking about QAnon and the growing anti-vaccination movement, which certainly is showing at least very worrying signs that it could develop into a movement like this. And obviously that's got pretty sizable overlap with the far right too. But part of my thought was, we're now at a stage, and hopefully including this study, where there is around a dozen or so data-driven studies that look at online radicalization almost exclusively. Of any of the studies that have kind of reasonable samples with some kind of generalizable findings, almost exclusively either completely jihadist or lightly dominated by jihadists. So Professor Gill's work is actually a good example of one that does include both a range of ideologies, but for the most part, there's been a very exclusive focus on jihadists. Now, when the premise of your question is that it seems, from looking at a lot of these cases, that there is a really important, there's a very important online component, and I don't think anyone is disputing that. But it seems to me that some of these assumptions are very similar to the debates that were being had in 2013, 2014, when we were looking at, a huge number of young people, on Twitter, engaging with Islamic State and then moving on. And that was very much being decried as cases of online radicalization as well. Now, it seems to me that your assertion is very plausibly correct. And I reserve the right to change my feelings about whether online-only radicalization is possible when the evidence changes, and I would like to research this empirically myself. But there is still, I say there's a dearth of data-driven online radicalization topics. There is a complete dearth of studies of terrorist behaviors looking at online radicalization from a far-right perspective or an anti-vax perspective. What we have is some case studies, whether it's the Christchurch shooter or similar cases, Breivik and things like that. But we don't have anything which is able to has large enough samples that we can start to statistically look at it. And I would refer to Professor Gill's work, who does actually suggest that when he looked at far-right terrorist use of the internet, that they were using the internet substantially more, and he was able to demonstrate that statistically. So in answer to your question, completely plausible, and I look forward to finding out. But I do think that I would hold caution on the basis of kind of the bias that comes out in the media of which is often very much looking first for evidence of online activity, as well as the fact that often offline networks, it takes a good amount of greater amount of digging to find out, and sometimes you only find that out at the back end of the criminal case, because the name's being kept out of the indictment for of offline networks for reasons that they might be currently under investigation, things like that. So what I think I'm suggesting is that there is still potentially something of an imbalance. That being said, and I think, again, what goes to the heart of the premise of your question, which I think I agree with, is that things like QAnon, what we're seeing is a movement which has really, for the most part, begun and sustained itself in completely the online domain. It will remain to be seen whether and to the extent of which it translates into offline networks, but it is certainly something which has grown and incubated within the online domain, and it could possibly act as something quite substantially different. I'm sorry, just to add one final point, I still think that my point regarding the ontological status of online, offline would still stand.
Mr. Candidate, the time allotted to the examination of your dissertation and its propositions has passed. The committee withdraws in order to deliberate. I request that you and your company await our return here. Okay, we're back in our small room here. Thank you all for your contribution to the discussion. Mr. Candidate, we have examined your dissertation and the propositions appended thereto. We have heard your defense, and we have also considered the report of the faculty concerning your previous studies. On the basis of this, we have decided to admit you to the doctorate. Professor Bakker is empowered to confer that dignity upon you in the customary fashion.
Volgaarne aanvaard ik de taak mij door de rector magnificus der universiteit opgedragen. Uit kracht van de bevoegdheid, ons bij wet toegekend, volgens het besluit van de commissie hier vertegenwoordigd, verklaar ik u bij deze Joe Whittaker te bevorderen tot dokter. Ten bewijze hiervan zal u het diploma door rector, secretaris en promotor ondertekend en met het grootzegel der universiteit bevestigd ter hand worden gesteld. Hoe we dat digitaal? Ik kan even door de camera. Having completed the duty assigned to me, I may be the first to address you as doctor and to congratulate you on the award of the dignity you have obtained. This honorable distinction is a well-deserved and highly valued privilege. At the same time, you are called upon never to lose sight of the obligations it imposes on you in the name of science and society.
Joe, it's a great pleasure I get to say congratulations, Dr. Whittaker. Thank you for a very spirited and insightful defence that showed your clear command of the subject. You've produced an excellent thesis that you can be really proud of. The question of online radicalisation is a timely and important subject at the heart of many debates in our field, and your thesis has taken forward both the academic research of how terrorists actually use the internet and also provided important findings for policymakers in this ever-evolving challenge. I remember in the early days of the PhD when you were trying to narrow down the focus of your research and how can we actually research how terrorists use the internet? And I was impressed at the time by your determination to be able to identify and collect empirical data, which I thought was commendable in a field which is often so much lacking such data. And your suggestion of using US court documents really allowed you to deliver on this. Whilst this is your big day, it's also a milestone for me, as Joe is my first PhD student, and is really proud, I feel very proud to be able to watch you be able to, all your hard work pay off. And as my first PhD student, I couldn't have hoped for a better candidate. Thank you for making it all so easy for me. It's been a great pleasure to see you develop from a young researcher and into a fellow peer, and someone who I regularly phone up and ask for advice and second opinion. It's also been really good to get to know you as a person over the last few years, and I have many fond memories. From our endless conversations on British politics, especially during the years of Brexit. Another was discovering that your skills stretch far beyond research and that you're quite on your way to becoming a budding master chef. I remember the very pleasant surprise the first time you invited me round for dinner and to be greeted with a magnificent feast of duck breast, which I think you had slow cooked for 12 hours to make it extra tender. It was absolutely delicious, and your dinner invitation soon became a highlight of my visits to Swansea. In the course of your PhD, you've had many great experiences and achievements. During your stay at Leiden University, you were involved in many projects as a research assistant. You also joined us at the International Centre for Counterterrorism as a research fellow and helped us on numerous assignments, including co-authoring a report for the EU Parliament on countering terrorist narratives. You were also seconded to Adaya, where you conducted research on the archive of counter-terrorist narratives. We also collaborated on research for the Global Internet Forum on Counterterrorism on the role of algorithms promoting extremist content in social media, which led to you presenting the findings in Washington, DC, and Ottawa, but also to being asked to brief both Google and YouTube and Facebook on your findings. And you're now part of the GIFCT working group on algorithms. You've also become a successful lecturer, teaching both bachelor's and master's courses at Swansea, and played a key role working with Stuart and Layla in setting up the MA in cybercrime and terrorism. And I've really enjoyed co-teaching with you on the course of Countering Violent Extremism Online, and it seems very fitting to hand this over to you as module director to take the course forward in your own direction. And finally, as you become doctor, you already have an impressive 5 peer-reviewed published journalist articles, and now 2 PhD students of your own. I have no doubt that you have a successful academic career ahead of you, and all that's left for me to say, once more, congratulations, Dr. Whittaker.
It is an agreeable duty for me, a very learned sir, to congratulate you upon your degree, also on behalf of the university and its Council of Deans. And herewith I declare this ceremony closed. But before we all leave, I would like to give all the people who were here online the opportunity to congratulate you in a more personal way. I hope you can all do it a little bit brief, besides the time. We'll do it in the same order as the opposition. So we start with Professor Gill.
Yeah, congratulations, Dr. Whittaker. I really enjoyed reading your thesis. Obviously, it makes a series of contributions to literature, and it was a pleasure to read and examine them. Well done today.
Dr. Weimann.
Yeah, Dr. Whittaker, congratulations for your PhD. Your thesis is really excellent and outstanding and makes a great contribution to the field. I think it will be also relevant for policymaking in the very near future. Thank you very much.
Professor Duivenstein.
Joe, congratulations, well done. I hope you will seek publication of your manuscript, and I look forward to your coming contributions to the discussion. Enjoy today.
Professor Koops.
Yeah, Dr. Whittaker, Joe, congratulations. Also on behalf of the Institute of Security and Global Affairs, you did very well. All the best now for the continuation of your academic career. You've got exciting years ahead.
Still Dr. Schuurman.
Yeah, jonge doctor, congratulations on obtaining your doctorate. I hope you really have a great celebration as well to mark this important occasion. And like my colleagues, I also look forward to seeing your continued contributions to the academic debate. Again, congratulations.
Then we move to the Swansea crew, I think. Professor MacDonald.
Congratulations, Joe, Dr. Whittaker. It's been a real pleasure for me to be able to be involved in supervising your dissertation, and we're all very proud of the work that you've produced, and we're looking forward to seeing you continue in your career.
And in the end, we have Dr. Nouri.
Dr. Whittaker, congratulations. You may be now officially a peer, but to me, you always have been. Your work has always been to such an amazing standard. Incredibly proud. You've got a lot to come. And
Okay, thank you all for your contributions. Again, congratulations to the candidates. Success in the future. This will end this ceremony. Thank you.